24th of December, 1914. The frozen mud of no man's land between the British and German trenches near Ypres held secrets that would shake the very foundations of military command. The war was barely 5 months old, yet already hundreds of thousands lay dead in the churned earth of France and Belgium. What happened next would become one of the most extraordinary moments in human history, yet it remains largely absent from official military records. As darkness fell on Christmas Eve, something unprecedented began to unfold along the Western Front. German soldiers, homesick and exhausted, started placing candles on their trench parapets and singing Stille Nacht into the bitter winter air. The melody drifted across the scarred landscape, reaching British trenches where men had been killing each other with rifles and artillery just hours before. Then, impossibly, British voices joined in with Silent Night, the same hymn in their own language. Private Frederick William Heath of the Northumberland Fusiliers would later write in his diary that what followed seemed like a collective madness, a sudden outbreak of humanity in the midst of industrialized slaughter. German soldiers began emerging from their trenches calling out, "Nicht schießen," and holding their arms high. British soldiers, against every military regulation and threat of court-martial, climbed out to meet them. According to research documented in the Imperial War Museum archives, this spontaneous truce occurred across approximately 2/3 of the British-held trenches, affecting tens of thousands of soldiers. The men exchanged cigarettes, chocolate, and buttons cut from their uniforms as souvenirs. They showed each other photographs of wives and children. Some played impromptu football matches using tin cans as balls. German and British soldiers worked together to bury their dead who had been lying in no man's land for weeks, conducting joint funeral services and fashioning crosses from broken rifles. Captain Sir Edward Hulse of the Scots Guards reported that he spent more than an hour conversing in German with enemy officers, discussing the war's progress and sharing cognac. A German officer who had lived in England before the war showed him a Newcastle newspaper from just months earlier. The surreal nature of the encounter left many soldiers questioning the entire purpose of the conflict. Military commanders on both sides were horrified when reports reached headquarters. The High Command immediately issued strict orders forbidding any fraternization with the enemy, threatening severe punishment including execution for anyone who participated in such activities. General Sir Horace Smith-Dorrien sent an emphatic message to his subordinate commanders, stating that such friendly intercourse with the enemy was not to be allowed under any circumstances. Yet the truce persisted in some areas for days, with soldiers reluctant to resume killing men they had just shared Christmas dinner with. When the fighting finally restarted, many soldiers deliberately aimed high, unwilling to shoot at individuals they now knew by name. The following year, 1915, military authorities made certain such spontaneous peace would never happen again, scheduling major artillery bombardments for Christmas Eve to prevent any possibility of silence. This remarkable episode reveals a profound truth about the First World War that challenges the narrative of inevitable conflict. The ordinary soldiers on both sides often had more in common with each other than with the generals who commanded them from comfortable chateaux miles behind the lines. 3rd of October 1918, Major Charles Whittlesey of the United States Army found himself in an impossible situation deep in the Argonne forest of France. His battalion, consisting of approximately 550 men from the 77th Division, had advanced too far ahead of supporting units and was now completely surrounded by German forces. Cut off from supplies, communication, and reinforcements, they would become known as the Lost Battalion, though Whittlesey himself always rejected that term, insisting they knew exactly where they were. The situation deteriorated rapidly as German machine gun positions poured fire into the small pocket, where American soldiers huddled in hastily dug foxholes, casualties mounted by the hour. Worse still, American artillery, unaware of the battalion's actual position, began shelling their location, causing devastating friendly fire casualties. Whittlesey had already sent 2 pigeon messages requesting the artillery ceasefire, but received no response. His men were being killed by their own guns. In the command post, a small basket held the last remaining carrier pigeon, a blue checker cockbird named Cher Ami, which translates from French as "dear friend." The bird had already successfully delivered 12 messages during the Meuse-Argonne offensive. Now everything depended on this single pigeon making it through a gauntlet of German rifle fire to reach the division loft 40 kilometers away. Whittlesey hastily wrote a message on the thin paper used for pigeon communication. The note, now preserved in the National Museum of American History, read simply, "We are along the road parallel 276.4. Our own artillery is dropping a barrage directly on us. For heaven's sake, stop it." He included their precise coordinates and signed it, then carefully attached the message capsule to Cher Ami's leg. When the pigeon was released, German soldiers immediately recognized what was happening and opened fire. According to accounts documented by the Smithsonian Institution, Cher Ami initially circled back toward the command post, confused by the explosions and smoke. The American soldiers watched in horror, knowing their lives depended on this bird. Then Cher Ami gained altitude and turned toward the American lines, flying directly through a storm of bullets. The pigeon was hit almost immediately. Witnesses saw him falter in mid-flight, his body jerking as a bullet struck. Yet somehow Cher Ami continued flying, climbing higher above the shell-torn forest. Another bullet hit him, tearing through his breast. Still he flew. A third shot nearly severed his right leg, leaving it hanging by a tendon. Yet the message capsule remained attached to that damaged leg. 25 minutes later, Cher Ami arrived at the division headquarters loft, collapsing upon landing. The pigeon handlers were shocked to find him covered in blood, with a gaping wound in his chest and his leg barely attached. They carefully removed the message capsule, and within minutes the artillery barrage was redirected away from Whittlesey's position. Relief forces were organized and pushed through to rescue the lost battalion the following day. Of the original 550 men, only 194 walked out uninjured. Army medics worked frantically to save Cher Ami's life. They cleaned his wounds, sewed up his chest cavity, and when they could not save his shattered leg, they carved him a small wooden leg to replace it. The pigeon recovered and became a hero, awarded the French Croix de Guerre with palm for heroic service. General John Pershing personally praised the bird's valor. Cher Ami was eventually sent back to the United States, where he became a symbol of courage and sacrifice. When he died in June of 1919 from his wounds, his body was preserved and mounted by a taxidermist, and he remains on display at the Smithsonian to this day. 15th of May, 1915. A munitions factory explosion at Silvertown in East London had just killed 69 workers, yet the demand for artillery shells continued to accelerate at a staggering pace. Britain faced what became known as the shell crisis, where frontline troops were rationed to firing just a few shells per day, while German artillery pounded British positions relentlessly. The British Army needed millions of shells, and they needed them immediately. The solution would transform British society in ways that would never be completely reversed. David Lloyd George, then Minister of Munitions, implemented an unprecedented recruitment campaign targeting Britain's women. Within months, hundreds of thousands of women, many barely out of childhood, flooded into newly constructed munitions factories across the country. These young women, some as young as 14 years old, would become known as the munitionettes, or canary girls, nicknames that barely hinted at the dangerous reality of their work. Gladys Sangster was 17 when she began working at the Barnbow Munitions Factory near Leeds, one of the largest shell-filling facilities in the country. Her daily routine involved handling TNT, amatol, and lyddite, highly explosive compounds that needed to be carefully poured into artillery shell casings. The work required steady hands and intense concentration. A single mistake could trigger an explosion that would kill everyone within 50 meters. The conditions inside these factories were nightmarish by modern standards. According to historical records maintained by the Imperial War Museums, the women worked 12-hour shifts, 6 days a week, in poorly ventilated buildings filled with toxic fumes. The chemicals they handled were absorbed through their skin and lungs, causing their faces, hands, and hair to turn a distinctive yellow-green color. This was the origin of the Canary Girls nickname, though the reality was far less whimsical than the term suggested. The yellow discoloration was actually a symptom of TNT poisoning, a serious medical condition that could cause liver damage, anemia, and in severe cases, death. Many women suffered from toxic jaundice, developing symptoms including nausea, vomiting, abdominal pain, and eventually yellowing of the eyes and skin that intensified beyond the surface staining. Some died from liver failure. The factory medical officers tracked these cases, but production demands meant work rarely stopped. Beyond the chronic poisoning, the constant threat of catastrophic explosion hung over every shift. On the 5th of December, 1916, this threat became horrific reality at the Barnbow factory where Gladys Sangster worked. An explosion in room 42, where women were filling shells with TNT, instantly killed 35 women and girls. The blast was so powerful, it was heard 30 kilometers away in York. Gladys survived only because she had been assigned to a different building that day. Mary Lees, who worked at a munitions factory in Chilwell, Nottinghamshire, kept a diary throughout the war years, portions of which are preserved in the Nottingham archives. She described the morning of the 8th of July, 1918, when the Chilwell factory experienced a massive explosion that killed 134 workers, the vast majority of them women. Mary wrote about the sickening sound of the blast, the screams, and how she helped pull injured co-workers from the rubble, many of them unrecognizable due to their burns and injuries. Despite these dangers, the munitionettes produced an astonishing volume of munitions. By 1918, women comprised nearly 80% of the munitions workforce, manufacturing approximately 80% of all British weapons and shells. They filled over 100 million artillery shells during the war, each one packed with explosive compounds their hands had poured. The social impact was equally revolutionary. These working-class women earned wages previously unimaginable for females, some making as much as skilled male workers. They gained financial independence, social freedom, and a sense of their own capability that challenged Victorian assumptions about women's proper roles. 24th of August, 1914, young Sidney George Lewis stood outside an army recruitment office in Kingston upon Thames, watching men stream inside to volunteer for king and country. Britain had been at war with Germany for just 20 days, and patriotic fever gripped the nation. Recruitment posters demanded that men join up before it was too late, promising adventure and glory. Sidney desperately wanted to be part of it. There was just one significant problem. He was only 12 years old. The official minimum age for military service was 18, with parental consent required for those between 18 and 20. Recruits were supposed to be 19 before being sent overseas to combat zones. However, in the chaotic rush to build an army, these regulations were often treated as mere suggestions. Recruitment officers, under pressure to meet quotas and motivated by bonuses for each man enlisted, frequently turned a blind eye to obvious lies about age. Sidney was tall for his age, and like thousands of other underage boys across Britain, he simply lied when asked. He claimed to be 19 years old. The recruitment sergeant, either fooled by Sidney's height or deliberately choosing not to question an eager volunteer, accepted his word without requesting any proof of age or birth certificate. Within hours, Sidney Lewis had enlisted in the East Surrey Regiment and begun his transformation from schoolboy to soldier. The training was brutal for a child. Sidney weighed barely 45 kilograms and struggled to manage the weight of a full military pack, rifle, and equipment that together weighed nearly as much as he did. He was taught to use a bayonet, to fire a Lee Enfield rifle, to march for hours carrying heavy loads, and to follow orders without question. The military system treated him exactly as it treated every other recruit, with no accommodations for his actual age. By October of 1914, less than 2 months after enlisting, Private Sidney Lewis found himself aboard a ship crossing the English Channel toward France. He was 13 years old when he arrived at the Western Front and entered the nightmare landscape of trench warfare. According to research compiled by the Imperial War Museum, Sidney was almost certainly the youngest British soldier to serve on the front lines during the First World War. Though exact verification is difficult because so many boys lied about their ages, Sidney's battalion was stationed near Ypres in Belgium, one of the most contested and deadly sections of the entire Western Front. He experienced the Second Battle of Ypres in April of 1915, where German forces first deployed chlorine gas on a large scale. The yellow-green cloud rolled across the battlefield, causing men to choke and drown in their own fluid-filled lungs. Sidney, now barely 14, watched men die in agony around him. For months, Sidney's true age remained undiscovered. He performed his duties, stood his watches in the trenches, participated in raids into no man's land, and witnessed horrors that would have psychologically damaged a grown man. He saw his comrades blown apart by artillery shells, machine-gunned as they went over the top, and slowly die from infected wounds. He lived with lice, rats that fed on corpses, the constant thunder of guns, and the knowledge that death could arrive at any second. The deception finally ended in June of 1915. Sydney's mother, Annie Lewis, had been frantically searching for her missing son since he had run away from home nearly a year earlier. When she finally discovered he was serving in France, she was horrified. She wrote directly to the War Office, providing Sydney's birth certificate as proof that her son was only 14 years old and demanding his immediate return. The British Army had no choice but to comply. Sending children into combat was a scandal the military could not afford, especially as casualty lists grew longer and public opinion began questioning the war's conduct. Sydney was quietly removed from his unit and sent back to England. He was not punished for lying about his age, nor was the recruitment officer who had enlisted him held accountable. Sydney was simply discharged and returned to civilian life, traumatized by experiences no child should have endured. Sydney Lewis was far from unique. Historians estimate that as many as 250,000 underage British soldiers served during the First World War, with at least 4,000 of them killed in action. Their names appear on war memorials alongside adult soldiers, their true ages often dying with them. 7th of November 1914, the steamship carrying men of the 57th Wilds Rifles arrived at the port of Marseille on the French Mediterranean coast. Among them was Sepoy Khudadad Khan, a machine gunner from the Punjab region of British India. He and approximately 70,000 other Indian soldiers were being rushed to the Western Front to help stem the German advance toward Paris. These men, recruited from villages across the Indian subcontinent, were about to experience combat conditions they could never have imagined. The Indian Army's deployment to Europe was a massive logistical undertaking, involving the transportation of entire divisions across thousands of kilometers of ocean. These were professional soldiers from an army with proud martial traditions stretching back centuries. But nothing in their experience had prepared them for industrialized warfare on the scale they would encounter. Within weeks of arrival, Indian divisions were thrust directly into the most brutal fighting of the early war, particularly around Ypres in Belgium. On the 31st of October 1914, Khudadad Khan's regiment faced a massive German assault near the village of Hollebeke. Wave after wave of German infantry attacked the British and Indian positions. The 57th Wilds Rifles held a crucial section of the defensive line, with Khudadad operating a Vickers machine gun that provided devastating firepower against the advancing Germans. The battle became desperate as German forces concentrated overwhelming strength against the Indian positions. One by one, the soldiers manning the machine guns were killed or wounded by German artillery and rifle fire. Khudadad Khan's gun crew was wiped out around him, every man killed except himself. Despite being severely wounded with multiple injuries, Khudadad continued operating his machine gun alone, firing into the German ranks, buying precious time for British reinforcements to arrive and preventing a breakthrough that could have collapsed the entire defensive line. When the position was finally overrun, Khudadad was found unconscious among the bodies of his comrades, his machine gun empty of ammunition, surrounded by German dead. He had held his post even when every military principle would have dictated retreat. His actions that day earned him the Victoria Cross, the highest military honor in the British Empire. Khudadad Khan became the first Indian soldier to receive this decoration, a historic moment that should have been celebrated, but was instead largely forgotten in subsequent decades. The Indian Army's contribution to the First World War was staggering in scale. According to records maintained by the Commonwealth War Graves Commission and referenced in historical research published by the British Library, approximately 1.5 million Indian soldiers served during the war across multiple theaters of operation. They fought not just on the Western Front but in Mesopotamia, East Africa, Gallipoli, Palestine, and elsewhere. More than 74,000 Indian soldiers were killed, and another 67,000 were wounded. These men endured extraordinary hardships. The Indian soldiers sent to France and Belgium suffered terribly from the cold European winter, coming from tropical and subtropical climates, where many had never seen snow. The British Army struggled to provide appropriate cold weather gear, leaving Indian troops inadequately clothed against freezing temperatures. Frostbite became epidemic among Indian regiments during the winter of 1914 to 1915. Cultural and religious considerations complicated their service. Sikh soldiers required accommodation for their religious observances and dietary requirements. Muslim soldiers needed facilities for prayer and halal food. Hindu soldiers had caste considerations regarding food preparation and eating. The British Army attempted to accommodate these needs through separate cooking facilities and religious spaces, but the chaos of war often made such arrangements impossible. The wounded presented particular challenges. Separate hospital facilities were established for Indian casualties in England, including a major facility at the Brighton Pavilion, the former royal residence. Medical staff struggled with language barriers, as many Indian soldiers spoke no English and few British medical personnel spoke Punjabi, Urdu, Hindi, or the numerous other languages of the subcontinent. Injured soldiers found themselves isolated, unable to communicate their pain or needs. Thousands of kilometers from home in a strange, cold land, the propaganda value of Indian Army service was not lost on British authorities. Photographs of Indian soldiers in European trenches were widely distributed to demonstrate the global nature of the British Empire and to suggest that colonial subjects willingly fought for the crown. The reality was more complex. While many Indian soldiers served with genuine courage and professionalism, their participation was hardly voluntary in the broader sense given India's colonial status. Despite their massive sacrifice and distinguished service, the Indian Army's contribution was systematically minimized in British historical narratives of the war. 10th of December 1915, 2nd Lieutenant William Orpen of the Royal Army Medical Corps set up his easel in a forward position near the French village of Vermelles. Orpen was not a typical military officer. He was one of Britain's most respected portrait painters, recruited into a new and controversial program that would send artists to the front lines to document the war. What military authorities expected were heroic images suitable for propaganda. What they got instead was something far more disturbing and real. The official war artist program emerged from a growing recognition that photography, while powerful, could not capture the full emotional and psychological reality of modern warfare. Photographs showed facts, destroyed buildings, rows of casualties, soldiers in trenches, but they could not convey the atmosphere of dread, the psychological weight of constant danger, or the subtle human details that revealed the true nature of what men were experiencing. The British War Propaganda Bureau, in collaboration with the Ministry of Information, decided to send trained artists to fill this gap. Orpen arrived in France with considerable artistic reputation, but no real understanding of what he was about to witness. His early sketches and paintings attempted to find nobility and traditional military glory in the scenes before him. These initial works showed brave soldiers, dramatic moments of action, and compositions that might have come from paintings of Napoleonic warfare. The military authorities were pleased. These were exactly the sort of images that could inspire recruitment and maintain public support for the war. But as Orpen spent more time at the front, talking with soldiers, sleeping in dugouts, experiencing bombardments, and walking through the devastation, his artistic vision began to change. He started drawing what he actually saw rather than what he knew authorities wanted. His sketches became darker, more honest, increasingly disturbing. He drew exhausted men with thousand-yard stares. He painted the mud, the rats, the casual proximity of death. He captured faces showing not heroism but trauma, fear, and resignation. One of Orpen's most powerful works, completed in 1917, depicts a dead German soldier in a trench, his body contorted unnaturally, face gray, lying in muddy water. The painting is devoid of glory or meaning. It is simply death, random and grotesque. When Orpen submitted this and similar works to his military handlers, they were deeply disturbed. This was not what the war artists program was meant to produce. These images could undermine morale and turn public opinion against the war. Military censors began restricting which of Orpen's works could be publicly displayed. Some paintings were quietly suppressed, stored away and not exhibited until after the war ended. Orpen found himself in an impossible position. He was an officer in the British Army, required to follow orders, yet he felt a powerful moral obligation to document the truth of what he witnessed. His solution was to continue painting honestly, while becoming more strategic about which works he submitted for official approval. According to archives maintained by the Imperial War Museum, which holds many of Orpen's original works, the artist filled numerous sketchbooks with drawings that were never meant for official review. These private sketches are even more raw than his finished paintings. They show soldiers weeping, bodies in various states of decomposition, men driven mad by shell shock, the banal horror of industrialized killing. These images represent some of the most honest visual documentation of the First World War's reality. Orpen was not alone in this artistic rebellion. Paul Nash, another official war artist, wrote to his wife in 1917 describing his transformed mission. "I am no longer an artist interested and curious. I am a messenger who will bring back word from the men who are fighting to those who want the war to go on forever. Feeble, inarticulate, will be my message, but it will have a bitter truth, and may it burn their lousy souls." Nash's paintings depicted landscapes transformed into surreal nightmares, forests reduced to splintered stumps, earth torn and poisoned, all under skies filled with hostile colors. His work, We Are Making a New World, completed in 1918, shows a devastated landscape under a blood-red sunrise, the title dripping with bitter irony. This is not the glorious war of propaganda, but a vision of apocalyptic destruction. These artists faced a fundamental tension between their roles as military officers and their identities as artists committed to truth. They had been given unprecedented access to the front lines specifically to create propaganda, yet their artistic integrity demanded they document reality. Their solution was a form of creative resistance, producing enough acceptable work to maintain their positions while secretly creating the honest images they knew history needed. After the war ended, many of these suppressed works were finally exhibited publicly. The British public, which had been fed 4 years of sanitized heroic imagery, was shocked by what they saw. 28th of March 1916, Captain Oliver Woodward of the Australian Tunnelling Company descended into a narrow shaft beneath Hill 60 near Ypres, Belgium. The air was thick with moisture and the smell of earth and explosive compounds. His destination was over 20 meters underground, where he and his men were excavating a tunnel system directly beneath German positions. What they were building would become one of the most devastating weapons of the entire war and one of its best-kept secrets. The Western Front was not just a surface war of trenches and barbed wire. Beneath the torn landscape, a second war was being fought in total darkness by specialized miners and engineers who dug elaborate tunnel systems under enemy lines. This subterranean warfare had its own unique terrors, and the men who fought it deserved their own special recognition for courage in circumstances that combined the dangers of combat with the claustrophobic nightmares of deep mining. The concept emerged from the static nature of trench warfare. When armies could not advance across the deadly ground between trenches, military planners realized they could potentially advance underneath it. If tunnels could be dug beneath enemy fortifications, massive explosive charges could be placed and detonated, destroying defensive positions from below and creating opportunities for infantry assault. Both sides quickly embraced this strategy, leading to an elaborate underground war. Britain recruited experienced coal miners, many from Wales and northern England, to form specialized tunneling companies. Australia and Canada contributed their own mining experts. These men brought professional mining skills to military problems, excavating tunnels using techniques developed in civilian mines but adapted for military purposes. The work was extraordinarily dangerous. Tunnels had to be dug silently to avoid detection, using hand tools rather than noisy machinery. The deeper they went, the greater the risk of collapse, flooding, or deadly encounters with enemy counter-tunnels. Captain Woodward's mission at Hill 60 was part of a massive British mining operation planned for the Messines Ridge area. The British planned to detonate 19 massive mines simultaneously beneath German positions, creating explosive force on a scale never before attempted. For over a year, British, Australian, and Canadian tunneling companies worked in absolute secrecy to dig tunnels and place enormous quantities of explosives beneath German strongpoints. The psychological stress on tunnelers was immense. They worked in near-total darkness in spaces so narrow they often had to lie on their sides to dig, never certain whether German counterminers were tunneling toward them. Both sides employed listeners, men who would press specialized listening equipment against tunnel walls trying to detect enemy digging. When enemy tunnels were detected nearby, the race was on to either break into the enemy tunnel first or to detonate a small camouflage charge to destroy the enemy tunnel before they could do the same. According to military records documented in research by Simon Jones published in the Imperial War Museum Review, underground combat was frequent and horrifying. When tunnels intersected, men fought hand-to-hand in darkness, using shovels, picks, and pistols in confined spaces where strategic movement was impossible. Some tunnelers were buried alive when charges detonated nearby. Others drowned when underground water was hit. Many suffocated when ventilation failed or when enemy actions cut off air supplies. The physical conditions were nightmarish. The tunnels were cold, wet, and muddy. Men worked in water that sometimes reached their waists. Pumps constantly fought against seepage. The deeper tunnels suffered from heat as the miners approached the Earth's natural thermal gradient, creating oppressive conditions where men worked stripped to the waist, despite the overall cold. Rats infested the tunnels, and disease spread rapidly in the confined, unsanitary conditions. The payoff came on the 7th of June, 1917. At 10 minutes past 3 in the morning, British engineers detonated 19 mines simultaneously beneath German positions along the Messines Ridge. The explosions were the largest non-nuclear human-made explosions in history up to that time, containing approximately 455 tons of explosives. The blast was heard in London, over 200 kilometers away. Entire German units, possibly as many as 10,000 men, were instantly obliterated, literally buried alive or vaporized by the colossal explosions. The earth itself shook like an earthquake. 19 massive craters appeared instantaneously, some over 25 meters deep and 70 meters across. The psychological impact on surviving German soldiers was devastating. Many surrendered immediately, too shocked to resist. The British infantry assault that followed captured the ridge with relatively light casualties, achieving in hours what conventional attacks had failed to accomplish over years. Not all the mines detonated that morning. One failed to explode due to a technical problem. Another was never detonated because British forces had already overrun that sector. These unexploded mines, each containing tons of explosives, remained buried beneath the Belgian countryside. One detonated accidentally in 1955 during a lightning storm, creating a crater and reminding the world of the dangers still buried from the war. 1st of January 1918, the troopship carrying the 369th Infantry Regiment docked at the French port of Brest. The men who disembarked were African-American soldiers from New York, many of them from Harlem, who had volunteered to fight for a United States that systematically denied them basic civil rights. They would become known as the Harlem Hellfighters, a regiment that would spend more consecutive days in combat than any other American unit in the war. Yet their story would be largely erased from American military history for decades. The 369th was a National Guard unit from New York, originally called the 15th New York National Guard Regiment. It was led by white officers, including Colonel William Hayward, but was composed primarily of African-American enlisted men. These soldiers had joined expecting to fight alongside other American units, to prove their worth as Americans and as men, and to demonstrate that African Americans deserved full citizenship rights. Instead, they encountered the brutal reality of American military racism. When the regiment arrived in France, the American Expeditionary Forces Command under General John Pershing faced a dilemma. The United States Army was rigidly segregated, and white American commanders did not want African American troops fighting alongside white American soldiers. The official explanation was that black soldiers supposedly lacked the courage and intelligence for combat roles, despite overwhelming historical evidence to the contrary from every previous American war. General Pershing's solution was to effectively give the 369th Infantry Regiment to the French Army. The regiment was reassigned to the French 16th Division, re-equipped with French weapons and helmets, and integrated into French command structure. For the African American soldiers, this assignment proved to be both humiliating evidence of American racism and an unexpected liberation from it. The French Army, desperate for reinforcements and less concerned with racial hierarchies, treated the Black American soldiers as combat equals. Private Henry Johnson from Albany, New York, became the regiment's first hero on the night of May 14, 1918. Johnson was on sentry duty with Private Needham Roberts at an isolated listening post in the Argonne Forest when a German raiding party of approximately 20 soldiers attacked their position. The Germans intended to capture prisoners for interrogation and to test American defenses. Johnson and Roberts fought desperately against overwhelming odds. Both men were quickly wounded, Roberts so severely he could barely move. Johnson fired his rifle until it jammed, then threw grenades until his supply was exhausted. When German soldiers rushed forward to capture the wounded Roberts, Johnson attacked them with his bolo knife, a large blade the Americans carried for cutting wire and vegetation. According to the official French military citation, Johnson killed at least 4 German soldiers in hand-to-hand combat and wounded many more, preventing the capture of either American soldier despite being wounded 21 times himself. The French military awarded Johnson the Croix de Guerre avec Palme, France's highest military honor, making him the first American soldier of any race to receive this decoration. The French press celebrated him as a hero. Yet when Johnson returned to the United States after the war, he found himself still subject to Jim Crow laws, still denied the right to vote in much of the country, still treated as a second-class citizen. The American military establishment largely ignored his heroism. He received no American military decoration during his lifetime and died in poverty in 1929. The 369th Regiment as a whole compiled an extraordinary combat record. According to research documented by the Smithsonian Institution's National Museum of African American History and Culture, the regiment spent 191 days in combat, more than any other American unit. They never lost a trench, never had a man captured, and never gave ground except on orders. The entire regiment was awarded the Croix de Guerre by France. 171 individual officers and men received the Croix de Guerre or other French decorations for valor. The regiment's reputation for fierce combat earned them the nickname Hellfighters from German soldiers who faced them, though the origin of this specific term remains disputed among historians. What is undisputed is that they fought with exceptional courage and effectiveness despite inadequate training, less equipment than white American units received, and the psychological burden of representing their entire race in the eyes of skeptical white observers. When the 369th Regiment returned to New York in February of 1919, they marched up Fifth Avenue in a victory parade before enormous, cheering crowds. For a brief moment, it seemed their sacrifice might translate into improved treatment and expanded rights for African Americans. Instead, the post-war period brought increased racial violence, including the Red Summer of 1919, when white mobs attacked black communities across America, lynching returning black veterans who were sometimes still wearing their military uniforms. The heroism of the Harlem Hellfighters was systematically minimized in official American military histories. 23rd of April, 1915. Vera Britton was 21 years old when she walked into her first military hospital ward and confronted a reality that would shatter every romantic notion she had held about war. The ward was filled with men destroyed in ways that exceeded her sheltered imagination. Some had lost limbs, others had faces so damaged that bandages covered everything except one eye. The smell of infected wounds, disinfectant, blood, and human waste hung heavy in the air. This would become her daily reality for the next 3 years as a volunteer nurse in the Voluntary Aid Detachment. Britton had fought her conservative family to attend Somerville College at Oxford, a significant achievement for a woman in 1914. When war broke out, she watched her brother Edward, her fiancé Roland Layton, and her friends leave for the front filled with patriotic enthusiasm and the certainty they would return as heroes. She felt compelled to contribute something meaningful rather than merely waiting at home. Against her family's wishes, she suspended her university studies and volunteered as a nurse. The Voluntary Aid Detachment, commonly called the VADs, was a civilian volunteer organization that supplemented the professional nursing service. Most VADs were young women from middle-class and upper-class families with no medical training. They received brief basic instruction in bandaging and ward hygiene, then were thrust into roles caring for severely wounded soldiers. The professional military nurses often resented these amateur volunteers, viewing them as privileged girls playing at nursing. The reality was far more complex. Britain's early nursing assignments were at hospitals in England, caring for wounded soldiers evacuated from France. Even this was traumatic, but it was merely preparation for what came next. In 1917, she volunteered for overseas service and was sent to a military hospital at Étaples in France just behind the front lines. This facility received the most severely wounded directly from the battlefields, men who might not survive the journey back to England. The conditions at Étaples were medieval despite being barely 3 years in the past from our current perspective. The hospital complex consisted of row upon row of wooden huts and canvas tents. During winter, these structures provided minimal protection against the cold and damp. During summer, they became stifling hot, and the smell of wounds became almost unbearable. Flies were everywhere, spreading infection despite desperate efforts at sanitation. Rats infested the hospital grounds, drawn by waste and the proximity of so much blood and death. Britain's duties were exhausting and emotionally devastating. Shifts lasted 12 hours or more, during which she might care for dozens of patients. Some had relatively straightforward wounds that would heal with time. Others had injuries so severe that death was inevitable, and nursing care was simply about managing pain until the end came. She changed bandages that revealed ghastly wounds, cleaned men who could not clean themselves, held the hands of dying soldiers who called for mothers and wives who were not there. The emotional toll was compounded by personal tragedy. In December of 1915, while Britain was nursing in England, her fiancé Roland Leighton was killed by a sniper on the Western Front. She learned of his death through an official telegram. He was 20 years old. The pain of this loss haunted her even as she continued caring for other wounded men, seeing in each of them the death she had not witnessed, but could not stop imagining. Worse was to come. In 1917, her brother Edward survived the Battle of the Somme and was awarded the Military Cross for bravery. Then, in June of 1918, just months before the war ended, Edward was killed in action on the Italian front. Britain's close friend Victor Richardson was also killed earlier that year. Geoffrey Thurlow, another close friend from the same circle, was killed in April of 1917. Within a few years, every young man in her close social circle was dead. According to her memoir, Testament of Youth, published in 1933 and later referenced extensively in historical studies of women's wartime experiences, Britain struggled with the seemingly pointless nature of the suffering she witnessed. She watched young men die in agony from infected wounds because antibiotics did not yet exist. She saw men driven insane by shell shock, their minds broken by experiences beyond human endurance. She cared for soldiers whose faces had been burned away by flamethrowers or destroyed by high-explosive shells. Men who would survive but whose lives were essentially over. The gas cases were particularly horrible. Men who had inhaled chlorine or mustard gas died slowly, drowning as their lungs filled with fluid or suffering chemical burns throughout their respiratory systems. There was little nurses could do except try to make them comfortable as they suffocated. Britain described the sound of gas casualties struggling to breathe, a sound that would haunt her dreams for the rest of her life. The war transformed Britain from a sheltered young woman into someone who had looked directly into the worst of what human beings could do to each other. She returned to Oxford after the war and completed her degree, but she was profoundly changed. 8th of November 1918, a German delegation crossed the front lines under a white flag, traveling in several cars toward the French forest of Compiègne. They had been summoned to negotiate an armistice, an end to the fighting that had consumed Europe for more than 4 years and killed over 17 million people. Leading the delegation was Matthias Erzberger, a civilian politician and member of the German Reichstag. He was about to sign a document that would end the war but also destroy his own life, making him the target of nationalist fury and eventual assassination.